It was the kind of cold that pressed against the skin like wet cloth, lingering, unwelcome, and unnerving. Mark had arrived at the station late, his fingers stiff from the bite of November air, his breath rising in shallow puffs as he approached the platform. The sky was a heavy slate, a dull bruise of cloud rolling across the horizon, swallowing the last remnants of sunlight. The station was quiet, too quiet. He wasn't late. Not really. The train was scheduled for 9:47 p.m., and according to the large hanging clock above the ticket counter, it was only 9:43. But the platform was empty. No passengers waited on the long benches that lined the yellow striped edge. No employees stood at the far end to wave down arriving cars. There was nothing, just the distant screech of wind funneling through the tunnels and the eerie, static hum of old speakers left on but devoid of announcements. Mark looked around, mildly confused. He had expected at least a few other people. This wasn't a small-town station. It was on the edge of a city that rarely slept, always pulsing with motion, always alive. But tonight, it felt dead, worse than dead, forgotten. He pulled his coat tighter around his chest, absently rubbing his palms together. In his left hand, his ticket crinkled slightly, still warm from his pocket. He glanced at it again, though he'd checked it 3 times already. The departure time was correct. The destination, vaguely printed in almost smudged letters, read simply, Harlow End. He didn't recognize the name. It hadn't been his choice exactly. The trip had been booked by a third party, a job interview that required travel, but had been oddly elusive about the details. Still, he needed the work, and the email had promised reimbursement and accommodation. He hadn't questioned it much. The rails began to hum. It was subtle at first, a low vibration that moved up through the soles of his boots. He stepped back slightly, looking down the tunnel. Far away, 2 lights emerged like dull eyes in the dark, slowly swelling as they approached. The sound grew louder, metal on metal, sharp and echoing, a scream of friction that somehow sounded older than it should, as if the very train was groaning under its own age. The train slid into the station with unexpected grace, its many cars gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. It was old, that much was clear. The exterior was worn, the windows dark and cloudy with grime. But it stopped precisely, its doors opening with a hiss. No one stepped out. Mark hesitated. He glanced behind him as if someone might be watching, but the station was still deserted. He looked back at the train. Its interior was dim, the soft glow of antique bulbs flickering gently along the ceiling. There were no voices, no footsteps, no announcements. He climbed aboard. The door hissed shut behind him, muffling the cold wind outside. Instantly, the air changed. It was warmer, but carried a stale scent like dust and time. The seats were upholstered in faded red velvet, the kind you'd expect to see in a long-forgotten theater. Brass fixtures lined the aisle, dulled by age. It should have felt comforting, even luxurious, but it didn't. The silence was oppressive. Mark walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have. He glanced into each compartment as he passed. Empty, all of them. Not a single soul. No signs of recent use, no crumpled magazines or empty coffee cups, just pristine stillness, as if preserved in glass. He chose a seat at random and sat near the window. Outside, the station remained unchanged. The fluorescent lights flickered. The platform stretched on in both directions, abandoned and quiet. Then, without warning or sound, the train began to move. Mark leaned back in his seat, trying to shake off the chill in his spine. He looked at his reflection in the window, blurred and ghostly in the glass. The lights inside cast long shadows down the corridor. No conductor had appeared to check his ticket. No welcome announcement. Just the steady hum of motion and the occasional rattle of the tracks below. The city slipped past in streaks of gray and black, buildings vanishing into the darkness, their windows like hollow eyes. The train picked up speed, the outside world becoming a blur. But it wasn't the usual blur of city to suburb travel. There were no recognizable landmarks, no billboards, no cars on parallel tracks, just endless concrete walls and tunnel mouths that opened like yawning jaws before swallowing the train whole. Time felt strange inside the train. Mark checked his phone. No signal. The time was frozen at 9:52, despite what felt like at least 20 minutes of travel. He frowned, tried refreshing it, but the screen flickered once and went black. Battery dead. Odd. He was sure it had been nearly full before he boarded. He tucked it away and looked around again. The lights above seemed slightly dimmer now, flickering longer between each pulse. The silence grew deeper, so complete it felt like pressure in his ears. He shifted in his seat. His breath clouded in the air again, though it was not cold. That uneasy sensation returned, like something unseen was observing from the far end of the car. He turned quickly, expecting something, but nothing was there, just more empty seats, shadows, and the faint groan of the train's motion. Outside, the scenery had changed again. The windows revealed not tunnels or cityscape, but wide fields shrouded in mist. Thin, skeletal trees dotted the landscape, their branches clawing upward as if in agony. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, bloated and orange. He hadn't noticed them leaving the city. He hadn't noticed any transition at all. It was as if the world had changed while he blinked. The train continued without pause, without voice, without any hint of destination. There were no stops, no announcements, just motion, always motion, carving through a world that felt increasingly unreal. Mark stood and began to walk. He moved from one car to the next, the doors sliding open with that same tired hiss. Each car was identical. Faded red seats, dull brass lights, no passengers, no conductor, no luggage. Not even dust disturbed the aisle. He walked through 5, then 6 cars, all the same. Perfect copies. It was as though the train had been copied and pasted into existence again and again. On the 7th car, something changed. The air felt heavier. The lights above flickered longer, pulsing in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The window panes were streaked with moisture now, as if the train had moved through some unseen rain. But the outside world remained dry. He noticed a door at the far end, different than the others, painted black, with a brass handle that gleamed more brightly than it should. There was something written on it, though the words were difficult to read. He stepped closer. Just as his fingers touched the knob, the train lurched. Not a gentle sway, but a violent jolt, throwing him back against a seat. The lights blinked out completely for a second. In that brief moment of darkness, he heard something. Movement, a soft rustle, a shuffle, breathing that was not his own. The lights snapped back on, empty, but something had changed. The air smelled of ash now, faint and sour. A low vibration thrummed through the floor, not like motion, but like a voice trying to speak through the steel. Mark backed away from the black door. He returned to his seat. Outside, the landscape was shifting again. The mist had thickened. The trees were closer to the tracks, warped and bent at impossible angles. The sky above was now deep crimson, no stars, no moon, just pulsing red clouds that looked like wounds. Still, no destination was announced. Still, the train moved. Mark's eyes drifted shut, heavy despite the anxiety clawing at his chest. But he did not sleep. Not really. His body felt weightless for a moment, then anchored sharply again, like he had fallen without moving. His vision blurred. Time slipped. He opened his eyes. He was in the same seat. The train was still moving, but the scenery was gone. Just blackness beyond the windows, not darkness. Blackness. A void. No sky, no ground, no motion. Just absolute nothing. The train still rattled forward, the sound unchanged, but outside there was no world to pass through anymore. He stood again, slower this time, steadier. He had to find someone, anyone. He moved forward, past car after car, identical still, yet the sense of something behind him had grown, as if whatever had brushed past him in the dark was now trailing him at a precise distance, staying just out of view. He reached the front car. It was different. There was a counter here, a cracked leather stool behind it, and another black door. This one was open, and there was a small, thin ticket lying on the floor. He picked it up. The paper was colder than it should have been, slightly damp. The ink was smeared, but the words were still legible. He read them, and in that moment, he understood that the train had no intention of stopping, ever. But that part hadn't reached him yet, not fully, not until he turned the ticket over and saw what was printed on the back, etched in sharp red letters like cuts in skin. Mark's hands trembled as he clutched the ticket, the edges digging into his fingers. He stared at the words until the letters seemed to waver like heat rising from scorched pavement. Final destination. The phrase burrowed into his thoughts, crawling beneath the skin like a splinter too deep to pull free. The train shuddered, as though acknowledging his discovery. The lights above flickered once, then dimmed further, leaving the car cloaked in a weak amber glow. The walls felt closer now, narrower, as if the train were shrinking around him, pressing in inch by inch. He turned from the black door and retraced his steps, the worn carpet muffling his hurried footsteps. Car after car passed in a haze. Nothing had changed outwardly, still the same faded velvet seats, still the same cracked windows, but the silence was different. It had weight now, a presence, as if the very air listened. Mark's seat was where he'd left it. But he didn't sit. He stood in the aisle and looked out the window. Nothingness still swirled beyond the glass, a black sea without stars, without shape, without end. He pressed his hand against the pane. Cold seeped into his skin, but there was no resistance. The glass rippled. It didn't break or bend. It yielded like water, as if the barrier between him and the void was only illusion. He jerked his hand back. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flash of motion in the window's reflection. He spun around, empty, but he was no longer alone. In the farthest row of seats, a figure sat motionless. Mark hadn't seen or heard anyone enter. One moment, the train had been empty. The next, this thing was there. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It faced forward, its form obscured by the dim light and the angle of its head. The body was too still, too perfect, like a mannequin posed with purpose. Mark swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward. The air felt thick, electric. His ears rang with a high-pitched tone he hadn't noticed until that moment, a constant noise just beneath perception, like an old television left on in another room. He took another step. The figure twitched. Just once. It didn't turn, didn't look, but its head shifted slightly to the side, as though listening. Mark froze. The train bucked violently, tossing him into the seat beside him. The lights died for a full second this time. In the dark, something moved. Fast, silent, inhuman. A scuttling just above his head, like fingers scraping across the ceiling. The lights snapped back on. The figure was gone. Mark shot to his feet and stumbled back toward the connecting door, breath catching in his throat. He reached for the handle, yanked it open, and stepped into the next car. The hiss of the door sealed behind him, and for a moment he leaned against it, trying to still his heart. He couldn't do this much longer. But where would he go? There were no stations, no signs of slowing, no windows to open, no staff to speak to, just the endless cars and the ever-present hum of something wrong. He pressed forward again, car after car. Now they looked different. The seats were torn, the walls smeared with dark stains that pulsed faintly like veins beneath skin. The floor creaked beneath him with each step, as though the train were made of bone and bending under weight it was never meant to carry. In the fifth car, he stopped. A mirror hung above the aisle, cracked through the center. It hadn't been there before, or had it? His reflection stared back, distorted, wrong. His eyes were darker, sunken, his skin pale, his mouth moved, though his own lips were still. He watched in horror as the reflection smiled. Then the glass shattered without sound. Shards fell to the floor but did not clink or crack. They simply settled like snow. And when Mark looked again, the mirror was gone. His pace quickened. Each car seemed to degrade further. The lights flickered more erratically. The air carried a sour stench, rotting fabric and something sweeter, cloying, familiar in a way he didn't want to name. The windows no longer showed blackness. Now they flickered with images, fleeting moments, his childhood bedroom, a hallway from his high school, the street outside his old apartment. But all wrong, warped, empty, silent. Ghosts of places, hollowed out by time or memory. In one window, he saw himself. Sleeping, he moved on. The next car was not a passenger car at all. It was narrow, metallic, cold. A service corridor lined with cabinets and tools he couldn't name. The walls were wet, glistening with condensation. Or was it something else? Shapes pressed out from the metal occasionally, like hands trying to break through, but always receding before they fully formed. At the far end of the corridor, a single light pulsed, not flickering, beating, like a heart. He approached it slowly. The rhythm grew louder in his chest, syncing with his own heartbeat until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The walls vibrated with each pulse. Whispers curled from the vents, indistinct, murmuring phrases that tickled the edge of meaning. He reached the door. This one had no handle, just a small slot. He recognized it instantly, the ticket. Hands shaking, he pulled it from his coat and slid it in. The door slid open silently. A stairwell descended into darkness. It shouldn't have been there. There had been no indication the train was more than one level. But there it was, twisting metal steps vanishing into the belly of the beast. Mark hesitated, then began to descend. Each step moaned beneath him. The air grew colder, thicker. Something ancient stirred below, a slumbering presence aware of his approach. He counted the steps at first, 10, 20, 30, but lost track as the darkness closed in. Finally, he reached the bottom. He stood in a chamber not meant for passengers, a room of machinery vast and alive. Gears turned slowly, covered in thick oil. Chains rattled overhead, looping into unseen mechanisms. The walls pulsed faintly as if breathing, and in the center of the room stood a figure, taller than it should have been, wrapped in shadows. No face, just a void where features should have been. It radiated a quiet malice, not aggressive, but ancient, inevitable. Mark didn't move. The figure did not speak, but a voice filled the chamber. Not a voice, an understanding. You boarded. You ride. That was all. Mark stumbled backward, turned, and fled up the stairs. He burst back into the corridor, gasping for air, the whispering louder now, more insistent. The walls seemed to close behind him, pressing, urging him forward. He ran through the next door, then another. The cars no longer matched the original train. They shifted styles, one Victorian, another sterile and modern, the next resembling a child's bedroom abandoned for decades. Nothing made sense. And then he found the passengers, not living, not dead, frozen in place, scattered across the seats, eyes open, mouths twisted in mid-scream, skin desiccated, flaking like old paint. Some clutched tickets. Others were slumped in unnatural positions, heads turned too far, fingers bent backwards. Each wore the same expression: realization. Mark moved between them, heart pounding. One woman's hand reached out, stiff as iron, as though trying to grasp his coat. He stepped back, and her eyes moved, just once, tracking him. He ran. He didn't stop until the cars changed again, no longer decrepit or surreal, but sterile. White walls, fluorescent lights, monitors flickering with static. It looked like a hospital. He entered a room lined with beds. Each held a version of him, some older, some younger, some twisted and broken, all asleep. Machines beeped beside them. Tubes ran from their arms. Nurses moved in the periphery, faceless shadows in white coats, whispering. He reached for one of the bodies, and its eyes snapped open. It screamed without sound. He turned and fled, back through the cars. The world outside the windows spun now, not passing, spinning, like the train were rotating in place, spiraling through some unseen drain in reality. Colors bled together, the void returned, the walls warped. He passed the first car again, his seat. The ticket was gone. So was the figure. But now the aisle was full. Passengers filled every seat, staring straight ahead, lifeless, silent. And one by one, they turned to look at him. All at once, the train screeched. The world outside flashed white. A blinding light flooded the car, and everything stopped. Silence, stillness, and then motion again, slow and deliberate. The passengers looked away. Mark collapsed into a seat. His mind frayed at the edges, reality bending in too many directions. He heard a bell ring. Once, twice. Then a voice over the speaker, crackling, garbled. "Approaching final destination." He looked up. The door at the front of the car opened. The conductor stood there, no face, no hands, just darkness beneath a uniform. It raised one arm and pointed, not at him, but at the window. Mark turned. Outside was a station, but it wasn't real. It looked like a painting of a place he'd once been, smeared with wet fingers and hung in a frame made of bone. The train slowed. Passengers rose, marionettes pulled by unseen strings. One by one, they walked to the door and vanished into the white light beyond. Mark stood. His legs obeyed before his mind could protest. He was walking. The door neared. Light swelled. The last words he heard before crossing were the conductor's voice, now clearer. No return. And then he stepped off into a place he would never leave. He stepped off the train and into stillness. There was no station, no platform, no air even, not in the way he remembered it. Just a strange expanse, endless and shifting, that looked like fog, but felt like memory. The ground beneath his feet had no texture. It wasn't cold or warm or solid. It was nothing and everything. Mark turned. The train behind him stretched into the distance, vanishing into the haze. He hadn't noticed how long it was. Now it seemed infinite. The windows were dark. The conductor stood in the open doorway watching, though it had no eyes. Then slowly, the door hissed shut. The train began to move again, but this time it traveled upward. It climbed into the pale sky, rising on invisible rails. The wheels turned without touching anything. The metal shimmered, groaned, and then the entire locomotive began to fade, dissolving into translucent dust. Mark watched it vanish, and he was alone. He didn't know how long he stood there. The world didn't move. There was no wind, no sound, no sensation at all except the distant beat of his own heart. Time stretched and unraveled like thread, slipping through unseen hands. He walked. There was no direction, no sign, no path, but still he walked. The fog shifted with each step, thinning, swirling, forming faint impressions that vanished before he could focus. A school desk, a hospital bed, a child's drawing in crayon, red scribbled across white paper. He recognized them. They were his, moments from his life, unbidden and incomplete, bleeding into the nothingness around him. Then, up ahead, a flicker of light. He moved toward it. The fog peeled back, revealing a door, not ornate, not ancient, just a simple wooden door painted white with a brass knob polished to a soft gleam. It stood alone. Behind it, something called to him. He hesitated, then opened it. On the other side was a room, familiar, his old apartment, every detail exact. The worn couch, the cracked tile by the kitchen sink, the photo frames on the wall crooked as he'd left them, the dust on the television. The air smelled like coffee and dry books. He stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. And something changed. The light overhead flickered. The walls trembled. He wasn't alone. A figure sat in his armchair. Mark stared. It was him. Older, paler, the same dark eyes, but filled with knowledge he couldn't comprehend. The other Mark looked up, smiled faintly, and raised a hand. The room twisted. Mark fell to his knees. Images poured through his mind, flooding in like a dam bursting. Every moment he'd forgotten, every dream that had slipped away, every time he'd walked into a room and felt a chill but shrugged it off. Every night he'd woken, convinced something had been standing at the foot of his bed. All of it came back. He saw the train, not once, many times, throughout his life, in dreams, in reflections, in the shadowed blur of passing tunnels. It had always been there, waiting. He had boarded it before, not in body, but in spirit, in moments of deep despair, in moments of near death, in moments when he had stood on the edge of something and not stepped back. And now he had gone too far. Now he had boarded in truth. The vision faded. Mark was alone again. The room was gone. He stood on a darkened shoreline, waves of black water lapping at his feet. Above him, The sky bled crimson, pulsing slowly, like lungs breathing. In the distance, a mountain rose from the sea, twisted and hollow, crowned with spires of bone. He began to understand. This place was not hell, not exactly. It was a crossing, a corridor between states of being, the final station between what he had been and what came next. The rules were not written. The doors did not always open. But for those who saw the train, who stepped aboard, there was no going back. Mark turned again. Behind him, others appeared. People, dozens, hundreds, all walking just as he had through the fog and silence. Some wept, some screamed, most were quiet, faces blurred by sorrow and confusion. One by one, they passed through unseen gates, disappearing into the landscape. Then he saw her, a little girl, 8, maybe 9. She held a stuffed bear in one arm, the fur worn down to the seams. Her eyes were wide but dry, calm. She walked up beside him, stopped, and looked up. Mark knelt. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card, a ticket. She handed it to him. He turned it over. Final destination. But this one had something his did not. An arrow, pointing forward. She walked on, following the invisible path that curved through the waves of mist. The water didn't touch her. The sky didn't dim. She vanished like a ripple fading across a lake. Mark rose and looked at his own ticket again. Still blank on the back, still a dead end. But as he watched, something new began to appear. Letters, slowly burning across the surface. Do you want to remember? The words pulsed, waiting. He felt the choice behind them. To remember was to know. To know was to see everything. He hesitated, then nodded. The ticket dissolved in his hand. The world cracked open. He saw it all, not just his life, but the lives of others. Millions of passengers, millions of journeys. The train was not bound by time. It moved through death and dream, through the veils between thoughts, memories, regrets. It fed on moments, not just souls, but the echoes left behind when someone dies, incomplete. Those who boarded the train were not all dead, not yet. Some were still lying in hospital beds. Some were lost in comas. Some had stood at the edge of bridges and blinked, and in that blink, they boarded. He saw himself, lying in a sterile hospital room. Machines beeped softly. A nurse adjusted a drip. A woman sat beside the bed, his sister, holding his hand, tears streaking her cheeks. He was in a coma, a car crash, rain, headlights, then black. That had been the beginning. The train had come when his mind hovered at the edge of return. He had boarded. Now the final choice remained. Mark turned. The mountain loomed closer, and now he saw the station atop it. A final place, a place beyond even this. He walked toward it. The fog parted before him. Each step felt lighter. The sky began to change. The red faded to gold, then to a soft gray. The sea grew still. The mountain shadow stretched behind him. And then, just before he reached the summit, he stopped. A figure waited at the gates. The conductor, still faceless, still silent. But now, Mark understood. It wasn't a being. It was a function. The keeper of transition, the vessel of passage. It stepped aside. Mark passed through the gate. Light enveloped him. He heard the train one last time, distant, mournful, eternal. Then silence. He opened his eyes. White walls, ceiling tiles, a beeping monitor, voices, hands holding his, tears, laughter. The real world. He was back. Mark stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, chest rising in slow, steady rhythm. He had returned. The train had let him go, or maybe he had chosen to leave it. But deep inside, he knew the tracks remained, And one day, when the final crossing came, he would board again, and this time